Hey guys, tonight we begin with the damp scratch of straw, the scent of earth and bodies, and the quiet endurance of peasants who lived without soap, sinks, or silence. The wind rattles through thatched roofs. Beneath the low beam of an oaken ceiling, a child stirs in sleep, wrapped in a woolen blanket that smells faintly of smoke and sweat. The hearth still glows, barely, a single ember blinking through soot dot outside. The mud thickens with the memory of footsteps. Bare soles, worn boots. Everything carries the weight of use. The wooden spoon passed from palm to palm, the tunic handed down, never washed but always worn. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only. If it feels right, let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Because where we're going, time is more a matter of sunlight and frost. A place where the days stretch with labor and the nights contract around small comforts. A flicker of warmth, a crust of bread, a child's breath in the dark. There was no mirror for most. No scented soap. No glass bottle of lavender water to dab behind the ear. Hygiene wasn't a practice. It was a negotiation between need and scarcity, between what you could scrub away and what you had to live with. This isn't the history of kings and plagues. Not tonight. Tonight, we descend into the quieter grime, the ordinary, the worn-in, the long-lingering, into a world where water was cold, rare, and never wasted, where filth wasn't failure, it was insulation. Into the lives of women who washed with ash, of men who scratched through wool, of children whose first smell was smoke and soil. And before we wrinkle our noses at them, we'll sit beside them, feel the itch of unwashed linen, the sting of a cracked heel, the hush of shared scent beneath the same roof. Because the story of medieval hygiene is not about how dirty they were. It's about how clean they tried to feel. So tuck in, breathe deep, and drift with me through the softness of suffering and the quiet poetry of staying warm in a cold, unwashed world. And that brings us to chapter 1. There was always something. Under the nails, a crescent of earth, blackened with repetition. Not just from farming, but from feeding animals, stoking fires, crushing herbs, sowing, scrubbing, shaping, digging. Fingers did not rest, and neither did the dirt that clung to them, soft at first, but then hardened into something like armor. Hands in the medieval village were a kind of diary. They recorded things the mouth never said. Blisters from the yoke, cracks from winters, breath, tiny wounds that never quite healed. No one cleaned them the way we think of cleaning, not with running water. Not with bubbles or bright scent. If water was fetched, it was for drinking or dough. It had to be carried, cupped, and cradled. It was not to be spilled on skin unless necessary. And so the nails stayed lined with work. A thin half-moon of brown that said, "I've lived today," was never far. It sifted through the thatch roof during storms. It caked to the sides of clay mugs. It slept in the folds of wool skirts. Children played in it, grew in it. They were born into rooms where walls flaked with dried mud, where straw lay underfoot not as flooring, but as a kind of compromise with the ground. There were no tiles to scrub, no polished floorboards. Just earth, packed, patted, sometimes swept with a twig broom. And the broom itself? Dirty. There was no shame in it. Not really. Only modern eyes find shame in the grime of labor. For them, for those who lived it, dirt was just a material. Like wood, like wool, like breath. It meant the carrots had been pulled, the firewood gathered, the sheep tended. It meant the world was still turning, still giving. If a person's hands were clean, it was suspicious. What were they hiding from? Who was doing their work? There were times, of course, when the dirt was washed. Not ceremoniously, not fully, but when a birth was coming or a wound needed mending. Then, Water was warmed in clay pots, cooled by breath, and poured into wooden bowls. The fingertips dipped first, then the palms, then the wrists, always quickly, and never with soap, because there was none. Ash helped. It scraped, it softened, mixed with lard or just rubbed on its own. Ash gave the illusion of cleaning. It wasn't sterile, but it felt like intention, a gesture toward care. Some scraped their nails with a knife, not to look better, but to keep the dirt from piling too high, from growing heavy beneath the skin. Sometimes it wasn't even hygiene. It was superstition. Dirt near the heart line, some believed, was bad luck. Others said the earth under nails protected against evil, that spirits couldn't take hold if the soil already had . And sometimes it was just a mother looking at her child's hands and saying, "That'll do for today." They didn't know the word bacteria. They knew illness, yes. They knew the sting of infected cuts and the red swelling that meant a finger might be lost. But they didn't trace it to the dirt. They traced it to God, to air, to imbalance. Cleanliness wasn't a cure. It wasn't even expected. Living was living through winter, through harvest, through the death of a cow, the birth of another mouth to feed. And when every day asked so much, fingernails were the least of it. There's something strangely beautiful about it, about the acceptance. The way a woman folded her arms, hands still smudged from soil, and sat by the fire with her baby. The way a boy, picking lice from his hair, ran those same dirty fingers through a basket of apples. No pause, no shame, no scrub. And yet there was tenderness. A girl tracing a name into the mud behind the barn. A man smoothing the dirt over a shallow grave. Hands pressed together in prayer, grime nestled in every line. It wasn't filth to them. It was their fabric, the texture of their time, the memory of their day. Because in the dark, when the candles died and the animals quieted and the family lay together beneath itchy wool and thick air, no one thought about the dirt beneath the fingernails. They thought about the hunger that hadn't been too sharp, the weather that hadn't been too cruel, the moment of laughter by the bread oven, the child who had made it through another day, with warm feet and a whole voice. And in that stillness, the dirt didn't matter. It belonged to them, just as much as the land did, just as much as their names. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Water was everywhere, but rarely warm. It came from the sky without asking. It filled barrels, soaked wool, and pooled beneath cottages after a storm. It wasn't clean, not by our standards. It carried the taste of wood, of moss, of old iron rings. It smelled of the world it passed through. But it was what they had, and still they used it to care. No basins lined with porcelain, no taps to twist, just buckets filled from wells, or streams if you were lucky, or the dark mouth of a rain barrel tucked behind the home. The water was cold, sometimes sharp with frostbite, sometimes only numb. But even so, it was cupped in palms, brought to the face, and pressed gently beneath the chin, not to be clean, to feel something else. The cold was honest. In a world full of layers, of fabric, of mud, of unspoken things, the shock of water was a moment of clarity. A woman might lift her skirts to the knee, dip her feet into a stream, and hiss through her teeth, not out of complaint, but recognition. The water reminded her she was still there, still real, still soft beneath all that roughness. Children did not think twice. They chased it, splashed through it, slipped on moss-covered stones with arms flailing and cheeks bright. The laughter it drew out was warmer than the sun itself. Even the old ones would watch them and smile, if only for a breath, as if remembering something that hadn't touched them in years. A cloth would be dipped. Worn linen, gray with age, used again and again. The cloth would be twisted, then unfolded across a forehead, a shoulder, the curve of a neck. And as the cold sank into the skin, steam would rise from where warmth met winter. It wasn't bathing. It was more sacred than that. A man, alone in the dark, rubbing his hands with icy water after a long day of fieldwork, may have felt the closest thing to comfort he knew. Not luxury, but release. There was no privacy, not really. No bathroom to close the door against. But still, moments found their own kind of solitude. A boy at the edge of the barn, kneeling beside a trough, whispering to himself while splashing water on his cheeks. A girl with cracked feet, dipping them into a basin warmed beside the hearth. Hiding her sigh in her mother's wool skirt. It wasn't about removing all the dirt. That was impossible. It was about softening it, loosening what clung too tightly, letting the skin breathe, even for a little while. Ash would follow, or lard, or nothing at all. Just the water, the cold, the moment. A ritual not written down, not spoken aloud, passed through eyes, gestures, instincts, and somehow, even though it chilled the bone, it warmed something deeper, because to be touched, even by a cloth, even by water, was rare. Intimacy was not expected. Yet here, in the act of wiping away a bit of yesterday, there was connection. A father wiping a child's mouth. A woman pressing a cloth against the temple of her aging husband. A sister patting her brother's muddy. Arms before supper, her hands shivering slightly, not just from the cold. Sometimes they added herbs. Mint, if it grew. Chamomile. A few crushed leaves, steeped in boiled water and left to cool. Not to cleanse, to soothe. The scent filled the air for just a moment, softening the heaviness of the room. And that was enough. It wasn't frequent. Most days passed without any cloth at all. But when it came quietly, like everything in their lives, without grandeur, but full of meaning. They didn't speak of cleanliness the way we do. They spoke of readiness, of being presentable for church, of not smelling too strong at the market, of being able to stand beside someone without apology. That the cold water did not cleanse in full, but it allowed for these things. It gave the illusion of control in a world that rarely offered it. You could not control the weather, or the rats, or the ache in your joints, but you could wring out a cloth and press it to your throat. And in that small gesture, something stirred, dignity, perhaps, or defiance, because while the world expected you to survive in filth, to sink into it without complaint, you could still say, not today, not all the way. Sometimes, when the cold was too much and the day too long, they would simply watch the water. Let it ripple in the barrel. Let it reflect the moon. Let it hold the sky. It reminded them that something clean still existed, even if not for them. And perhaps that was enough to keep going. To feel the cold on the skin was to know the difference between numbness and a liveness. To wipe away a layer of dirt, even if more would come tomorrow, was to say, I am still here, still soft beneath the rough, still warm beneath the cold, and no one had to see it. No one had to know. It was enough that they knew it for themselves. They were always there, even when the room was quiet, when the fire had faded to a dim breath in the hearth, when everyone had settled into the soft chorus of sleep. The lice did not rest. They hid in the seams of tunics, in the creases of elbows, in the tangles of long hair wrapped under cloth. They moved in silence, but their presence was never subtle. You could feel them. A slow crawl, a sudden itch, a bite that didn't bleed, but burned all the same. They weren't considered strange. Everyone had them. The lord in his hall, the priest in his robes, the peasant in her patched skirt, all lived with the hum of tiny legs beneath their clothes. There were no shampoos, no plastic combs, No sprays with strong smells. There were fingers, and fingernails, and patience. Mothers became hunters, sitting cross-legged near the hearth, pulling a daughter into her lap, parting her hair with practiced hands. The light from the fire was dim, but enough. Each strand was inspected, each movement slowed to softness. The mother would pinch the creature between thumb and nail, crush it with a faint click, then wipe her hand along her apron. No fuss, no sound. Just another part of the day. Dotted wasn't just the hair. They crept. Into beds, into seams, into anything with warmth. The straw mattress shifted at night, not from dreams, but from scratching. Feet rubbing against rough linen. Elbows dragged across knees. The discomfort was as common as hungered-out children learned. Not to complain. Only the very young cried. The rest scratched in rhythm with the creaks of wood and the rustle of blankets. And yet there was care. Lice were part of the world, but so were the hands that tried to remove them. Ash was rubbed into scalps. Vinegar, if it could be spared, was dabbed behind ears, down the spine. Oils made from goose fat or herbs were spread through the hair, not to kill, but to distract, to calm the skin. Even lye was used, though rarely. It burned more than it soothed. Clothes, when they could be changed, were boiled in pots if water was abundant, but it was not. So instead, tunics were laid near the fire. The heat did not cleanse, but it stirred. The lice sent them scrambling into the open, where they could be caught, one by one. The lice never slept, but neither did the love that chased them. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like. More nights like this. A father, quiet after supper, sitting on a stool and scraping his ankles with a dull knife, not in anger, but with dull persistence. A wife combing through her husband's beard, her hands steady despite the day's exhaustion. A girl lifting her shirt in secret, running fingers along her ribs, seeking out the small invaders in silence. This was not glamour. This was not disease. This was simply the cost of living among cloth and warmth and time. Even the animals shared. Them, the pigs, the dogs, the goats, they all scratched against doorposts and wooden beams. And sometimes, just for a moment, man and beast understood each other perfectly. To itch was human. To scratch was survival, but every scratch told a story. Of long days, of layers never removed, of wool that couldn't be washed, only beaten and aired and hoped for the best. Even in church, people shifted on their benches. A hand to the back, of the neck, a subtle drag along the arm, all beneath the gaze of icons and saints that no one judged. No one whispered, because everyone understood. They lived close together, slept close. A family of 5 to a single room, a single bed. The lice didn't need permission. They moved freely, without prejudice. But there was still pride. People did what they could. They swept the floors. They hung their cloaks on pegs to air them out. They tied their hair in cloth. They whispered remedies to one another in the dark. Try nettle soaked in rainwater. Boil rosemary and leave it in the sun. Say a prayer before combing, and they'll go away faster. Faith and folklore tangled together like hair. Both offered something. Not always answers, but hope. And in that hope, there was humanity. The lice never slept, but they never broke anyone. People endured. They laughed. They kissed. They danced with lice beneath their collars and still called it joy, because the body may have itched, but the soul still found ways to rest. A child falling asleep with a hand in her hair. A man humming as he scraped his scalp. A woman, eyes closed, letting the wind take her hair as she stepped outside for a moment alone. They knew the lice would return, but they had lived another day. And sometimes that was enough. Morning did not arrive with alarms. It crept in through the gaps in the wood, where the wind had left its whispers. The coals in the hearth were no longer red, but gray, a soft dusting that remembered heat. And before anyone spoke, someone moved. A hand reached for the kettle. Another reached for the child. A shiver passed from one woolen blanket to another. No one leapt from bed. That kind of energy was saved for summer. In winter, you rose with reluctance, like bread that needed coaxing to rise. Before the animals stirred, before the tools were touched, there was the business of the body. Not luxury, not cleanliness, just readiness. Water from the pail, if it hadn't frozen, was ladled into a basin. Ash from the hearth, still warm to the touch, was scooped into a small clay bowl. If oats remained from the night before, crushed, softened, they were added in. This was the morning soap. Not to cleanse, but to soften. To rub into the hands, the arms, the face, gently, without rush. The ash acted as a scrub. The oats added something else, a texture, a smell, a softness that felt kind, even if it came from the bottom of the pot. Fingers dipped into the mix. Palms cupped it. A woman leaned over the bowl, her breath misting the surface. A man pressed it along his neck, not flinching at the chill. It wasn't pretty, but it was familiar. And in the ritual, there was a rhythm. Ash and oats, rubbed in, slow circles, sometimes with song, often with silence. A cloth was nearby, rough linen, frayed at the corners. It soaked up what it could. No mirrors, but the feel of your own skin beneath the fingertips was enough. Enough to know the day had started. And the children, they complained, of course. The ash was cold, the oats sticky, but they still let their mother wash behind their ears, even if they squirmed. And when she was done, they smelled not of perfume, but of fire and flour. If oats were precious, they were saved for mouths, not faces. But a little mush from the pot, the crust along the edge, the part no one wanted to eat, became a kind of luxury. A mother might take a small smear, warm it in her hands, and press it to her cheek with closed eyes. Not because it worked, but because it felt like something soft in a world that was not. Ash came from everything. The fire that had cooked dinner, the branches collected with numb fingers. It held memory of warmth, of labor, of survival. And it clung to skin, to fabric, to the corners of mouths. Sometimes the washing wasn't even for hygiene. It was for waking. Cold ash, wet cloth, and the strange comfort of being touched, however briefly, was how the body came back from sleep. A man rubbed his hands together at the door, ash on his knuckles, oats still under his nails. He didn't care. The pigs were waiting. The bread needed kneading. The sun, pale and shy, was already stretching across the trees. There were no beauty routines, only rituals of necessity. A girl tying her hair back with soot-stained fingers. A boy rubbing his teeth with a twig dipped in ash. A grandmother spitting into her palm and smoothing down a child's cowlick. If there was time, the water might be warmed. If there was kindness, it might be done by someone else's hands. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. But more often, it was quick. A splash, a scrub, a pat of the cloth. And then the rest of life began. They didn't speak of self-care. But in these moments, raw, brief, and soot-streaked, there was care. Deep care for oneself. For the skin that still carried warmth from the night. For the face that must meet the cold. The fire might not last the day. The food might run short. But there had been water, ash, and oats this morning. And that was something. Even the poorest, with no oats to spare, found something. A bit of straw ash. A pinch of clay. A splash of water caught in a leaf. And the hands moved, always, not to make clean, but to remind the skin it still mattered. Sometimes, at the edge of the village, someone would wash with snow. Not often. But when it came, when it piled high against the door and sparkled like crushed glass, a woman might step outside, gather a handful, and press it to her brow. She would not laugh, but she might smile. It's cold. It stung, but it woke her up. And in that moment, beneath a sky that didn't know her name, she was ready. Ash and oats, the morning's armor. Not enough to stop the hunger, not enough to change the world, but enough to begin. It lingered in everything. The smell of smoke. Not the sharp, stinging kind, but something softer, worn in, gentle in its persistence. It lived in the walls, in the folds of wool, in the braids of a child's hair. It curled beneath beds, above beams, and every breath exhaled inside those. Homes of mud and straw. There was always a fire somewhere. It could not be avoided. It warmed the stew, boiled the wash water, dried the wet tunics. It was a blessing and a burden. And slowly, without permission, it became a scent. Not of danger, but of daily life. Clothes hung near the hearth absorbed it like memory. A woman's shawl, placed too close to the flames, would hold the smoke for days. A man's cloak, dried above the fire after a storm, wore the smell into its seams. They didn't have perfumes. No vials of pressed petals or glass stopper bottles. But they had this, a scent that belonged only to them. It masked what needed masking. The sweat, the livestock, the human closeness that came from too many people in too little space. Smoke was honest. It told you a meal had been made. That warmth had been conjured from cold. That someone had cared enough to tend a fire until the wood became embers, until the embers became sleep. And in time, it became comforting, even romantic. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Lovers smelled it on each other's skin. Parents smelled it on their children's hair. It became a kind of presence, even when no flame was lit, a ghost of heat, a whisper of survival. When villagers walked into the forest, they took the scent with them. Out among the trees, they smelled of something more than soil. They smelled of home. And when they returned, if the fire had gone out, it was that same smoke scent that brought it back, stirred the memory of warmth and the instinct to rebuild. Sometimes, a stranger might pass through, someone from a different village, or a traveling friar, and they would comment quietly on the heaviness of the air. But to the people who lived there, it was not heavy. It was grounding. Children knew the fire before they knew the stars. They were held near it, fed beside it, comforted by it. And with every hug, every touch, the smoke moved from one body to the next like a secret. Clothes were never quite clean. Even freshly washed ones, dried beside the fire, were touched by its scent. Blankets, once aired, still returned with the smell. It sank into wool like warmth itself. In spring, the air changed, but the smoke remained. In summer, windows were opened, but still. It stayed. It was not just wood that burned. It was straw, dung, peat, whatever could be spared. And each gave its own version of smoke. Some sharp, some sweet, some with a hint of moss or rot. But all of it clung. They didn't resist it. They didn't try to wash it out. It wasn't something to get rid of. It was something to carry. It meant something had been alive. A fire, a meal, a moment. And sometimes, when someone was dying, the fire would be stoked all day. The smell would fill the home like a second breath, not just for warmth, but because it comforted the soul to know the scent of life was still there. A young woman might hold her mother's hand by the hearth, both cloaked in the same invisible layer of smoke. She wouldn't say much. She wouldn't need to. The smoke said enough. There was beauty in how it smoothed everything. Like a soft filter over reality. It blurred the lines between clean and dirty, between now and yesterday. A shirt worn 3 days in a row still smelled of fire, hair. Unwashed for a week still carried warmth. And when the wind blew through the village and carried the scent away, it felt strange, like forgetting something you just remembered. Some would gather herbs to burn alongside the wood. Not often, but on special days. A sprig of rosemary, a twist of dried mint, and the smoke would shift just slightly, taking on a fragrance that felt like intention. It wasn't perfume in the way we know it, but it was a message, a note, a whisper. We're here. We're still here. They didn't think in terms of fragrance. They thought in terms of memory. And smoke, more than anything, was memory. It filled the gaps in conversation. It settled on the shoulders of silence. It reminded the skin that it had been near heat, and the soul that it had been near home. Even now, if you've ever stood near a wood-burning fire, and hours later caught a trace of its scent on your sweater, you felt it, that strange mixture of nostalgia and grounding. That's what they felt every day, all the time. Smoke as a shield, smoke as a signature, smoke as a soft kind of perfume, worn by all, loved by most, and forgotten by none. The feet knew everything. They carried the story of every step, every chill, every stone, every field of uneven earth. And unlike hands, they were not often seen, but they were always felt. A life on foot was a life half soaked in mud, half calloused by cold. Boots were a luxury, leather cracked, wool unraveled. Most wore shoes that had long stopped protecting, thin soles, patched holes, wet toes that never fully dried. And so, washing the feet became an act not of hygiene, but of mercy. The rest of the body might go untouched for days, sometimes weeks. But the feet, they asked for relief. They didn't demand it. They simply throbbed. And in the quiet hush of night, when chores had settled and the wind paused at the door, someone would fill a basin. Not large, not deep, just enough for 2 ankles and a prayer. The water might be lukewarm, sometimes barely, above cold, but it was more than temperature. It was time. Time to sit, to pause, to care. A mother might kneel before her child and rub away the day with a linen cloth. A wife might remove her husband's boots, one slow pull at a time, each thread of leather groaning. A grandmother, alone, might place her feet in a bowl by the fire and sigh, a sound that carried the weight of every winter she'd survived. The feet were where the body met the world. They were swollen by work, blistered by shoes too small, cracked by frost, hardened by age. And yet, they were forgiven. To wash the feet was to say, "You've done enough. You've brought me this far. Rest now. Nothing fancy. Just water. A cloth. Sometimes, if luck allowed, a sliver of lard or a dab of goose fat rubbed into the skin like balm. The heel might be scrubbed, the toes pulled apart, the arch traced slowly, not for pleasure, but for peace. And in those moments, something tender bloomed, not spoken, but felt. No one washed their own feet without remembering the touch of another. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. There was a stillness that came with it. The world narrowed. The noise of the animals dulled. The itch of wool softened. And there, in the flicker of firelight, a foot met water, and the body breathed a little deeper. Some said foot washing kept away fever. Others said it brought good dreams. Some just liked the feel, not the wash itself, but the care it represented, because feet were not glamorous. They were not adorned or praised, but they mattered. To wash them was to admit that even the lowest part of the body, the most forgotten, The most soiled deserved comfort. In churches, they reenacted the washing of feet. But in cottages, it was never ceremony. It was survival. It was kindness wrapped in routine. Sometimes, in the deepest winter, a child would cry out, not from nightmares, but from frozen toes. And a parent would rise, groggy and slow, and light a candle just long enough to warm a cloth, to press it around those tiny feet, whispering songs that didn't need to rhyme. In that moment, the whole world was reduced to 10 small toes. The rest could wait. The rest could stay cold. They did not think of it as ritual. But it was. A basin by the fire, a pair of tired feet, a cloth wrung twice, a silence that said everything. The feet were scrubbed until the skin remembered it was skin, until the nerves stopped shouting, until the soul softened, if only for the night. And when the basin was emptied, when the cloth was hung to dry, when the feet were tucked back into worn stockings and layered beneath blankets, something shifted. The body didn't feel clean, but it felt noticed. And that, sometimes, was better. The rest of the body, the back, the scalp, the belly, could wait. They could carry the dirt and the days. But the feet had to keep walking. So they were given a little mercy. A small bowl of water, a hand that knew their aches, a warmth that didn't need words. In summer, the washing moved outside. A girl dipping her feet into the stream, a boy balancing on a flat stone while kicking water at his brother, a grandmother sitting with her toes in the grass-heavy shallows, letting minnows tickle what age had numbed. But in winter, it always came back to the bowl, the hearth, the hush. The cloth might be shared. One basin, many feet. But there was no shame in it, only closeness. And when the feet were clean or close enough, the world felt slightly more bearable. The weight of tomorrow's steps still loomed. But for tonight, the feet had been held. And that made all the difference. Wool didn't pretend. It held the truth of everything, of work, of warmth, of weariness. It clung to the scent of the body like a second skin, and it didn't let go. Unlike linen, it couldn't be scrubbed into innocence. Unlike silk, it didn't whisper. Wool told the truth. It scratched when it was new. It sagged when it was old. And in between, it carried the weight of seasons, of sweat, of soot. Everyone wore it. Not because it was soft, but because it lasted. Because it warmed, even when wet. Because it wrapped the bones when the fire went out and the winds rattled the shutters. Wool was spun on long winter nights, pulled through calloused fingers, twisted, breathed on, sung to. It was dyed with roots and berries, or left plain, the soft brown of sheep, the ghost pale of undyed fleece. It carried the smell of the animal, of the woman who spun it, of the cottage where it dried. And once it was made, it rarely left the body. A tunic might be worn through 5 winters, passed down to a younger brother, patched with another's wool, then eventually cut into strips for the hearth. A cloak might be laid over the bed at night, then worn through the frost at dawn. It was never truly clean, but it was familiar. Wool never lied. It said, "This is who you are. This is where you've been." It grew heavy with time, with mud from the fields, with smoke from the fire, with salt from the skin. Children scratched at it until they didn't, until their bodies accepted the truth of it. That life wasn't about comfort. It was about carrying on. And so they carried the wool, wrapped around shoulders, tied at waists, pulled over heads as the cold crept in. It was both shield and confession. A woman might adjust her shawl not for style, but to cover a stain. A man might patch the elbow of his sleeve for the 3rd time, not to hide poverty, but to honor it. Wool held these memories, stitches sewn in silence, threads knotted with love, not flared. It was heavy in rain, but it still kept the cold out. Mostly Dot, it creaked when stretched. It curled at the edges, but it held Dot, and that was enough. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. To sleep in wool was to carry the day to bed. To wake in wool was to meet the morning already wrapped in memory. It never softened completely. It always reminded you of your body, your shoulders, your spine, your skin beneath. Some wrapped, newborns in it, a swaddle made of warmth and truth. The baby cried at first, but the wool remembered what the world forgot, that life is not meant to be smooth. It is meant to be real. Wool rubbed at the neck. It itched at the wrists. But it also clung when the wind pushed too hard. It shielded the heart. It muffled the sound of loneliness. There were no closets. Clothes were hung near the fire, laid flat on stones, folded under straw. And when someone entered a room, the scent of wool came first, then the sound, then the person. To wash it was dangerous. Too much water, too much agitation, and it would shrink, harden, so they aired it, brushed it, smoothed it with hands dampened in ash-water. And they accepted its flaws. Because wool was like them, imperfect, but enduring. Even the wealthy wore wool, though finer, dyed deeper, cut with precision. But in the village, it was all the same. Practical, patched, layered with labor. A woman might own one gown, one shawl. A man, one tunic. So wool wasn't fashion. It was identity. You could recognize someone by the drape of their cloak, by the way their sleeves hung, by the scent of their wool, smoke and skin and bread dough, if you knew them well enough. Sometimes the dead were buried in wool, a final embrace from the same threads that had warmed them in life. No silk shrouds, no perfumed linens, just a tunic, pulled over still limbs, folded with reverence. Wool aged with its wearer, stretched at the shoulders, thinned at the knees, faded but loyal. It never pretended to be beautiful, but it was. In the same way an old song is beautiful, in the way a cracked bowl is beautiful, because it lasted. A child might inherit a woolen cap, still warm from a grandfather's head. She might pull it low over her ears and say nothing, but feel everything. In summer, they wished to shed it, but even then, it stayed nearby. For the night, for the chill, for the storm that always came. It was too important to pack away. And so the wool stayed, always, even when it frayed, even when it didn't fit quite right, because wool never lied. It told them who they were, cold but not broken, warm but not undone, real. Night didn't bring peace. Not always. It brought pause, a hush between labors. But rest, that was harder to come by. The bed, if one was lucky enough to have it, was a frame of wood and a sack of straw. The straw poked through the linen, even when fresh. And it was rarely fresh. More often, it was damp from breath, from sweat, from the cold that never fully left. Blankets were heavy, wool mostly, sometimes patched with rabbit skins or old clothes, too warm to mend again. But even warmth came at a cost. It scratched, itched, pressed down like a second body. The night began with shifting, the search for a softer corner, a lump that could be flattened, a root that might be ignored, and always the familiar rustle of lice or fleas making their own beds among the straw. Children curled into their mothers. Fathers wrapped arms around legs, conserving heat. Some slept in shifts, some all together. One blanket, 5 bodies. Heat by proximity, dreams by accident. And yet sleep came, not easily, not sweetly, but eventually. It arrived between the aches, between the creak of joints and the sigh of cooling embers. It came when the mind gave in, when the body gave out. But it did not stay, because the body remembered. The day did not wash away just because the sun set. The grime lingered on the skin, in the folds of cloth behind the knees. Beneath the arms, sweat bloomed even in the cold. Not from heat, but from wool, from closeness, from the burden of the day still pressed into the pores. And when it came, it wasn't a trickle. It was a dampness that stuck to everything. The shirt clung. The sheets, if there were any, curled up like they'd had enough. Sleep turned to tossing. The dreams turned scratchy. And still, they slept, because what else was there? Even in discomfort, the body demanded a kind of escape. A girl turned on her side, cheek to straw, lips dry. A boy whimpered once, then stilled. A man coughed, not from sickness, just from the air, thick with dust and memory. No one changed into nightclothes. There were no such things. They slept in what they worked in. Clothes loosened, if possible, sometimes removed, but never far. In case of fire, of storm, of fear, the darkness was not kind, but it was consistent. And dreams? They were strange, sometimes vivid, sometimes just flickers. A loaf of bread, a warm stream, the face of someone long gone. And through it all, the skin itched, not just from pests, though there were plenty, but from the roughness of everything. The wool, the straw, the sweat, the skin itself. The body never really stopped feeling. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Sometimes a hand reached out in sleep, seeking relief, scratching the same place over and over until it faded into dreaming. Other times it was the blanket, kicked off, then pulled back. A war with warmth. And then there was the sound. A rat in the corner, the wind tapping at shutters. A cough, a groan, the slow creak of va. Settling wood. Night was not silent. It was alive. But even so, sleep came, not always full, not always kind, but enough. Enough to carry them into another morning, to another bowl of oats, another stretch of mud, another ache. Sometimes the dreams were soft, of sun, of singing, of fields without rocks, of a bed that didn't bite back. And they would wake, briefly smiling, before remembering where they were. But still, the dreams were theirs. No one could take them. Not the cold, not the lice, not the straw. They belonged to the sleeper. A quiet rebellion in a world that asked too much. Even in sweat, even through scratching, the mind slipped elsewhere. And in that elsewhere, there was peace, or something close to it. A flicker. A flicker was enough. The child rolled over, kicking. The blanket. The woman shifted, pressing her forehead to the wall. The man groaned once, then slept again. And outside, the sky turned. Inside, the night clung close. But they slept, despite everything, because bodies are strange and kind, and because dreams, even scratchy ones, are better than none. Not all cleaning was done in the open. Some things were quiet, hidden, and not because of pride, but in spite of it. In the medieval village, to be seen washing oneself, truly washing, was a kind of exposure. The body, already worn and shaped by labor, was not something to display. It was private. Not because it was sacred, but because it was tired. There were no bathrooms, no doors to close, just corners, curtains hung from beams, a sliver of shadow beside the barn, a stream at dawn when the mist still covered everything like a blessing. And there, someone would scrub, not the full body, that was rare. There was never enough time, or water, or warmth. But the parts that felt too far gone, they got attention. The underarms, the feet, the places where sweat pooled and shame followed. It wasn't luxury. It was necessity done in silence. A woman, lifting her skirts slightly, only as much as needed, to kneel beside a bucket and rinse her thighs. A man pulling off his shirt, one arm at a time, before dabbing his chest with a damp cloth behind the stable. A girl washing her face behind her long hair, curtained to the world. There was no perfume after, just the smell of water. Maybe ash, maybe vinegar, maybe nothing. And yet, afterward, there was always a pause, a moment of stillness, of something like relief. Not just from the dirt, but from the burden of carrying it. The shame was not in being dirty. It was in being seen trying not to be. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft light below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this, because washing suggested vanity, or wealth, or weakness. Those who tried too hard to be clean were whispered about. Why are they washing so often? What are they trying to wash away? But everyone did it. Eventually, quietly, they scrubbed with rags made from old tunics, with ash from the hearth, with rainwater if it could be gathered, with cloths dipped in water that had already been used once for dishes, or animals, or laundry. They crouched in corners and worked slowly, not because they had time, but because rushing made it worse. Too hard a scrub left the skin red, raw, stinging through the night, and so they worked gently, as if apologizing to their own bodies. A woman wiping beneath her arms with a piece of linen worn soft from use. A man pouring half a cup of water over the back of his neck, watching it drip into the dust. A boy washing behind his ears with fingers that still smelled of sheep. There was no soap, but there was intention. And sometimes that was enough. The shame lived only in the eyes of others. Alone, they felt no guilt. Only the need to feel human again, to feel the skin breathe, to rinse away just enough of the day to make sleep feel clean. In spring, the river helped. People ventured farther, claimed a bend in the stream, scrubbed with stones while watching for others. But even then, voices hushed, clothes half on, movements shielded by bushes or reeds. Cleanliness was not a public display. It was a secret, a gift given back to the body after it had carried the weight of labor, of hunger, of expectation. Mothers washed their daughters. Fathers taught their sons how to use a cloth without waste. And between them, a knowledge passed, not just of how to clean, but when and why. You didn't wash for others. You washed to keep going, to keep the skin from cracking, the sores from spreading, the stink from clinging too long. And after, there was no towel, just the wind, the sleeve, the same cloth, now wrung out, hung to dry in the sun if there was any. The body dried fast, because there wasn't much water, because the air took what it wanted, and when they stepped back into the world, they looked the same. But something had changed. A boy who'd washed behind the barn stood a little straighter. A girl whose mother had scrubbed her feet smiled at the floor differently. A man who'd splashed cold water down his chest breathed deeper. The skin still carried dirt, but not all of it. Not the worst of it. And that small difference was everything. The scrub did not make them new. It reminded them they were still theirs, still living, still more than the layers they wore. And when the night came, when the blankets curled and the sweat returned, there was a memory of water, a touch of coolness, a whisper of what it felt like to care. That it didn't matter that no one saw it. It didn't need to be shared. It was enough that, for a few minutes, the body was noticed by its owner, by the breath, by the cloth. And in a world of noise, that quiet was everything. Babies were born into a world already thick with scent, not sterile, not clean, but real. The smell of earth pressed into the floor, the smoke of the fire that never fully slept, the tongue of wool warmed by skin, and the faint, unchanging presence of bodies that lived too close. worked too hard, and bathed too little. This was the first world a child knew. And they didn't cry because of the smell. They cried because everything was bright and cold and loud, and suddenly nothing was holding them but hands. They were swaddled quickly, not in cotton or soft linen, but in whatever was warm. Strip of wool, a patch of rabbit skin, a shirt too small for its previous owner. They smelled of blood, of milk, of smoke, and of something soft beneath it all. A newness that hadn't yet been scrubbed away. Washing a newborn was rare. Too much water was dangerous. Too much cold could steal breath from lungs that had barely begun to learn how to breathe. So they were wiped, gently, with a cloth dipped in lukewarm water if there was time, with a hand if there wasn't. A mother might hold the child close and rub a thumb along the skin, brushing away what didn't belong, while whispering something too quiet for the room to hear. There was no baby powder, no oils, only lard, if it could be spared, and sometimes a crushed herb, folded into the cloth, not for cleanliness, but for comfort. Sage, chamomile, lavender, if someone had grown it that year. And still, the child smelled mostly like life, raw, warm, slightly sour. A smell that clung to the crook of the mother's elbow for days after the birth. The village smelled it, too. Everyone knew when a child had arrived, not just from the noise, but from the scent, a softness in the air, a sweetness mixed with sour milk and singed wool. And it made people pause, because the child was clean in a way no one else was. Not because they were washed, but because they hadn't yet lived long enough to be warm. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Even then, though, the world began to cling. The straw where they lay held dust and fleas. The cloth they wore had belonged to others. The skin-to-skin warmth they needed came with sweat and breath and the closeness of bodies that had not bathed in weeks. But the child didn't. Mind, they rooted toward warmth, not toward purity, and their first understanding of the world came through scent, the mother's skin, the wool of the blanket, the fire nearby, the sourness of milk, the metallic scent of blood, and the soft herbs if they were lucky. A baby learned the difference between the scent of a calm room and one filled with fear, between a clean cloth and a wet one, between the musk of animals and the warmth of arms. They knew these things before they knew words, before they knew light. When the child grew, a few weeks, a few months, the washing changed. They were not dipped, but dabbed. A cloth to the chin after milk, a fingertip behind the ears, a smear wiped from a cheek. They were not cleaned for appearance. They were cleaned because someone cared. And that care, though simple, was everything. In some homes, the baby was passed through smoke, held above the hearth, not too close, just long enough for the scent to cling. It was believed to protect them, not just from spirits, but from the world itself. In others, dried flowers were tucked near the cradle, not often, but when available. It didn't change the air much, but it changed how people felt when they entered. They would say, "It smells like a new one in here." And that was enough to make the room warmer. Children, even small ones, began to carry scent like their parents, the dirt on their toes, the wool at their backs, the food on their hands, the fire in their hair. But beneath it all, something lingered, the softness of skin that had not yet been hardened by years, a kind of innocence that no grime could cover. And when mothers held them close, even if their own bodies were layered in sweat and smoke and fatigue, they breathed it in. That mix of life, that reminder of beginning. And sometimes, when the night was still, a mother might lift the child and hold them just beneath her nose, not for checking, not for fussing, just to remember. To remember the smell of someone who hadn't yet learned how hard the world could be. And in that scent, there was hope that maybe, just maybe, something softer would last. Rain was not a nuisance. Not here. Not then. It was an arrival. A blessing with a sound. It began as a whisper, on the thatch, on the stone, in the field still clutching yesterday's dust. Then it built, drop by drop, until it sang, not loudly, but fully, the kind of music that filled the gaps between words and work. For those who had little water, the sky itself was a basin, the roof a filter, the barrels, old wine casks, or lopsided wooden tubs became treasure chests, brimming with what no hands had to carry. And when it rained, they didn't run. They stood in it, let it find them, let it wash them without judgment. A boy might lift his face and open his mouth, letting the sky feed him with laughter. A girl, barefoot in the mud, would spin in slow circles, arms wide, eyes closed. Not for play, but for freedom. The body, usually hidden, began to emerge. Not fully, but enough. Shirts were peeled off. Hair was unbound. Sleeves rolled past elbows stained with earth and sweat. And into the rain they walked. To be touched by rain was to be noticed by the world. And no one laughed. No one stared. Because everyone understood. It wasn't just water. It was permission. To be wet. To be bare. To be, for once, cleaner than before. Women brought out buckets to catch the flow from gutters. Men scrubbed their arms with handfuls of wet grass. Children lay belly down in puddles, kicking their heels in the air as if the sky had given them wings. And in these moments, there was no shame, because no one controlled the rain. It belonged to all, and it made equals of everyone it touched. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Sometimes the rain came too hard, too cold, too long. It turned the paths to rivers, poured through holes in the roof, soaked the beds, the wood, the bones. But even then, its first moments were welcome. Even then, it was greeted like a guest. Smell of it came before the drops, earth and ozone, and something ancient. The dogs barked, the chickens clucked and scattered, and the people paused whatever burden had gripped them, just for a second, to look up and say, "There, you are." Washing in the rain wasn't washing. It was surrender. A man rubbing his neck with both hands, eyes shut, letting the water trace the shape of a life too tired for words. A woman kneeling in the garden, scooping water from a puddle and pressing it into her scalp with fingers that smelled of garlic and firewood. No soap, no towels, just water. And ere. The wind carried the rain into corners, the open shutters, the cracks in the stone, the sleeves of cloaks hanging on pegs. And when it passed, everything was heavier, but somehow lighter. Inside, the room steamed. Clothes hung near the fire. Boots hissed as they dried. And the scent of wet wool, wet earth, wet skin filled the house like incense. Children sniffed their fingers, amazed at the smell of clean. Not the clean of shops or bottles, but the kind of clean that doesn't smell like anything at all. And that absence was a kind of miracle. The body, free from its usual cover of soot and sweat, felt unfamiliar, lighter, like it belonged to someone new. Women combed their hair with wooden picks, separating strands that hadn't seen water in weeks. Men wiped behind their ears and didn't flinch. Even the old ones, hunched, stiff, quiet, smiled a little, because the rain had touched them, and left something behind. Not moisture, not cleanliness, but care. The sky had remembered them. In summer, the rain was warm. It tickled. It laughed with them. In winter, it came as sleet or snow. But even then, the memory of summer storms lingered in their bones. And always, the first drops were met with gratitude. A bowl set outside the door, a head lifted from prayer, a child nudging their sibling and saying, "Come on before it." Stops. They had no faucets, no taps, no bathhouses, not here, but they had the sky, and every now and then it gave them more than they asked for. It gave them a moment to feel free, to feel clean, to feel something fall upon them that hadn't come from labor, from effort, from sacrifice. Just water, just rain, just the world remembering its people. The doorway told stories before a word was ever spoken. It framed the threshold between weather and warmth, between the hard world outside and the soft survival inside. And sometimes above it, or to its side, or tucked into a beam just beneath the roof, hung herbs. Not always fresh, not always full, but there, all the same. Bundles tied with twine, or twisted flax, dried mint, drooping rosemary, nettles that no longer stung. A row of sage, brown around the edges, but still holding its shape. They were not decoration. They were memory and protection. Some hung them to keep flies away, some to keep spirits out, some just because their mother had, and hers before her. The herbs didn't smell strong, not anymore. But if you leaned close, just close enough, you might catch it. A ghost of scent, earthy, bitter, real. It mingled with the other smells of the home: smoke, sourdough, wool, warmth, and softened them, not erased, just softened. It was said that herbs blessed a home, that they kept sickness from crossing the threshold, that when someone passed beneath a bundle of lavender, their burdens grew a little lighter. No one knew if it was true, but no one dared take them down. They were left to dry, to twist, to age. Some crumbled after a month. Others hung for years, growing dusty and gray, but never forgotten. Children reached for them, were told not to touch. "They're watching," a mother might say, half smiling. The herbs keep quiet when you behave, and so they became a kind of presence. Above the door, beside the fire, in small bundles tucked into pillows or placed beneath beds, not for fragrance, but for peace. Sometimes when someone fell ill, a handful would be steeped, boiled into a tea so bitter it made the mouth curl, or crushed into lard and rubbed into aching joints, or burned slowly so the smoke could clear the air. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The scent of burned rosemary was sharp. It climbed the nose and clung to the throat, but it also settled the room. And for those few minutes, everything felt still. In spring, the herbs were gathered, not in haste, but carefully, a basket on the hip, a knife in hand, a quiet child trailing behind. They picked what grew near: thyme from the edge of the well, chamomile from beside the stones, yarrow hiding in the tall grass. They brought them home like offerings, shook out the bugs, tied the stems, hung them, to dry above the door where everyone could see and be seen by them. Some villagers whispered that herbs had moods, that if they curled, it meant the house was tense. If they bloomed out of season, joy was coming. If they dropped suddenly, someone in the family had a secret. No one truly believed it. And yet, everyone watched, a brown bundle of sage, motionless for months, suddenly swinging without wind, and the whole house would pause. A gesture, a warning, or just the breath of something unseen. It didn't matter. Because in a world with little control, even the smallest mystery was cherished. The doorway was never bare, even in winter, even when the herbs were long gone. Something always replaced them: a bit of dried moss, pine needles, a ribbon, if one could be spared. To walk beneath them was a ritual. Returning from the fields, carrying in a crying child, bringing bread, bringing grief not always beneath the herbs. And sometimes people spoke to them, not out loud, just under their breath. A quick word, a wish, a whisper. Let him sleep tonight. Keep the fever away. Let tomorrow be kinder. The herbs never answered, but they never left either. When someone died, the herbs stayed up until the morning passed. Then they were burned or buried or scattered in the river dot, and new ones were hung in silence. The smell of fresh herbs, green and sharp and full of life, was a small miracle, a reminder that not everything had decayed. The herbs reminded the people that nature could be gentle too, that not every plant was poison, not every leaf was trouble. Some could soothe, some could bless, some could simply exist above the doorway, beside the heart, within reach, even if no one believed, even if no one remembered why they'd started. They still hung them because the doorway needed them, to mark the edge of safety, to carry the scent of care, to say, here, we tried out. It began as a tingling, a whisper beneath the skin, a patch of redness, a flake, a sting. Then came the itch dot, always the itch, and like everything else in the village, it was accepted, because what choice was there? The rash on the arm, the boil on the thigh, the scab that never healed, these weren't just discomforts. They were signs, sometimes of the weather, sometimes of the body, but often of God. Suffering was not separate from faith. It was part of it. If your skin burned, if your scalp blistered, if you scratched until you bled, it wasn't always a curse. It could be a trial, a cleansing, a lesson. Pain was not senseless. It was sacred. They believed that God spoke in fevers, in trembling hands, in spots that bloomed across the back like stars gone wrong. Some even said that the itch was to be touched, that angels brushed the skin as they passed, or that the devil did, depending on the day. Washing rarely helped. Ointments were few. Scratching was relief and risk in equal measure. But still, they bore it, because to complain too loudly was to seem ungrateful. To suggest that one's body had earned ease was prideful, so they itched quietly and called it endurance. A woman picking at her elbow during prayer, a boy rubbing his back against the barn wall, an old man tapping at a sore beneath his beard, eyes closed, lips moving with thanks. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The church taught that the body was temporary, a shell, a trial of flesh wrapped around a soul that needed refining. So when the skin suffered, it was purifying, preparing, making holy what was otherwise ordinary dot, and some found comfort in that. They believed that God gave each person what they could bear, that the itch, the rash, the swelling, they were gifts, strange as that sounds, proof that the body was paying its price dot, and perhaps, they thought, if it burned here, it would not burn later. But not all saw it that way. There were whispered cures, herbs boiled into bitter teas, clay smeared onto sores and left to dry, nettle stings, meant to distract the pain with sharper pain. A mother might mix ash and lard, rubbing it into her child's back while muttering prayers and pressing a kiss, to a temple that hadn't known rest. And still, the itch came back. It waited. It whispered. It crawled through wool and crept into the hours when the mind was too tired to fight. But no one thought of it as strange, because everyone itched. The poor, the pious, the proud, each in their own way, each in their own corner of night dot. There was dignity in pretending it didn't matter, in sitting still while the skin begged to be torn, in folding hands during Mass when what you really wanted was to dig into the place behind your knee. God would know. So you held still And when someone broke, when they scratched too hard, too loud, too long, the room didn't judge. They just nodded. Another trial, then. Another soul being refined. Children, too, learned young. To slap, not scratch. To whisper their pain, not cry it. To carry the itch like a mark of growing. Some superstitions offered comfort. If you itched on the left hand, money was coming. If your nose twitched, someone was speaking your name. If your feet tingled, you were being summoned, and in that way, the discomfort had meaning. And meaning made it bearable. Priests sometimes offered blessings. A hand on the head, a thumb traced in oil, a whispered Latin phrase that no one understood but everyone trusted. Not healing exactly, but attention. And that mattered because to be seen in your suffering, even for a moment, was a balm. Even if the itch returned an hour later. There were moments of joy, too. A sudden relief. A day when the skin felt calmer, when the fire dulled, when the redness faded, and those days felt like miracles, not because the rash had gone, but because for a brief moment the body felt like home again. A child running without pausing to scratch. A woman reaching to hang herbs without flinching. A man sleeping with both hands still. The body, even with all its flaws, was still theirs. Still capable of work. Still capable of prayer. Still capable of carrying them through another day. And so they bore the itch, not with joy. Not with peace, but with faith, because if God had given it, there must be purpose. If the pain had a name, they'd learn it in time. If the skin burned, perhaps it meant the soul was close to something pure. And when the night came, and the scratching returned, they whispered into the dark, "Thank you. I'm still here. Let me rest, even with this." Not everyone washed themselves, but someone washed for them. She rose before the sky turned gray, hands already stiff, knees already aching. She did not complain. There was too much to carry for that, because she carried it all. The dirt, the stains, the fabric of everyone else's life. She was the washwoman, There was no magic in it. No glamour. Only cold water, heavy cloth, and the endless rhythm of scrub, wring, rinse, repeat. The clothes were dropped at her door in baskets or bundles, or just flung in silence. Wool cloaks, undergarments, aprons with grease, tunic hems stiff with muck. She took them, not with pride, not with pity, just with practiced hands, and she walked. To the river, if it hadn't frozen. To the trough, if it hadn't dried. To a barrel with rainwater and soaproot, if she'd been lucky enough to gather it before frost. She walked through fog, through mud, through silence. And always, the bundle grew heavier, not just with fabric, but with what clung to it, the smells, the sweat, the hints of lives lived hard and quiet. She knew each family by scent. One reeked of onions and smoke, another of goats, another of old herbs and sour milk. She never said a word, just dunked the cloth, pounded it on a flat stone, scrubbed it with ash and lye until the water darkened like storm clouds. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The water numbed her fingers, sometimes cracked the skin until it bled. But she kept going, because it had to be done. Cleanliness wasn't a gift, it was a service. A duty performed out of sight, without thanks, and yet, without her, no one felt. Human, it was her hands that lifted the smell from the fabric, her arms that wrung out the cold, her breath that steamed the air each winter morning. She hung the garments on lines strung between crooked trees, pinned them with bits of twine and old nails, and waited. The wind was her only helper. The sun, when it appeared, her only warmth. When it rained, she gathered everything again. ran barefoot, skirts dragging, muttering curses into the grass. Never stopped. The washwoman knew what filth meant. Not judgment, not shame, just work. She saw no sin in the stains. Only the story of the week. Spilled stew, blood from a lamb, soot from the chimney, something unspoken in the bedsheets. Cleaned it all. Without asking, without wondering, without telling because the fabric would forget. But she wouldn't. She remembered the weight of a man's shirt after burial. The silence of a baby's blanket never returned. The sudden change in a woman's underthings when a secret could no longer be hidden. Still, she scrubbed. Sometimes she hummed, low, wordless, just enough to keep time. Other days, the water was too cold for sound, and she worked in silence. Then, echo of stone and splash and breath the only rhythm in the world. The soap was harsh, her hands raw, but the cloth came clean, or close enough. She never folded anything delicately. There was no need. It would wrinkle again the moment it was worn, but she handled it gently, even when her back screamed, even when her arms shook, because she knew this was someone's second skin, and for a day, maybe two, it would feel new. That mattered more than anyone knew. She did not preach. She did not pray, but every act of washing was a kind of devotion, a faith in renewal, a belief that, beneath the grime, there was something worth saving. The others rarely looked her in the eye, not out of cruelty, out of discomfort. She reminded them of what they shed, of what they couldn't bear to carry, and so they thanked her with bread, with coin, with nods, but not with closeness. Still, she washed, because someone had to, because everyone needed clean, even if only for a moment, even if the dirt returned by dusk. She washed until her fingers no longer bent, until her knees refused to kneel. And then, she sat on a stool near the fire and let the steam rise from the basin, not toward heaven, but toward rest. The fire hissed. The cloth dripped. Her eyes closed, and for once her hands were still. The burden, just for a breath, had been lifted. When nothing else worked, they turned to fire. It was the final answer, the last resort, the one thing that could take what water, cloth, and prayer could not and burn it away. Fire didn't ask. It didn't pause. It simply took, and in that there was both fear and comfort, because for all its danger, fire was honest. It could destroy a tunic thick with disease, a mattress crawling with life no one could see, a cradle, a cloak, even a home, if it came. To that. They didn't want to, but sometimes they had to, when illness lingered, when nothing smelled right, when the air itself felt wrong. They gathered what they feared and set it alight, rags that had touched the sick, blankets too wet for too long, a pile of straw that had held too many restless nights. They burned it, not always with ceremony, often in silence. A patch of earth behind the barn, a pit lined with stones, a clearing just beyond the hedgerow where the wind carried the smoke away from the sleeping. The flames rose slowly, then fast. And with them went the memories. A shawl someone had worn every day for 6 winters. Gone. A tunic with the stitching still visible from a sister's hand. Gone. And yet, in the smoke, something lifted. Not just scent, but burden. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. It wasn't about destruction. It was about release. Fire didn't care about sentiment. It cleansed by force. And in a world where control was rare, that power meant something. Afterward, the earth was blackened. The air smelled sharp. The sky carried the ghosts of things no longer carried. And slowly, something new began. Ash swept aside. New straw laid down. New cloth sewn with care and hope. and the quiet wish that it might last longer this time. Sometimes they burned just for the feeling that an old pot of oil left too long, the corner of a page with strange markings, a lock of hair tied with thread, meant to keep fever at bay, but now feared for the same reason. Superstition ran deep, but fire ran deeper. It made no distinction between truth and fear. It burned both. And so they used it, carefully, desperately, with reverence and regret. Children watched from doorways. Fathers stood with arms crossed, eyes on flame. Mothers turned their faces, letting only the smoke reach them. Sometimes the fire gave nothing back, just silence, just ash. But sometimes it left something behind. Warmth, a flicker, a clearing in the air, a feeling that something wrong had finally left, and the body breathed easier. They didn't speak of it afterward. Not much. The thing was gone. That was enough. But they remembered the smell. Wool turned to smoke. Flesh once, in times too dark to name. Hair, bitter and strange. Linen, sweet, almost. The scent stayed, long after the fire had died. Some took the ash and scattered it into fields, into streams, into corners no one visited. Others saved a pinch, believing it held what the cloth could not. A kind of quiet power. It was rubbed into wounds, pressed into doorways, sprinkled into soup when no one was looking. Fire did not judge, but people did. And so they used its memory carefully. In winter, fire was a friend. In sickness, it was a judge. In fear, it was a savior. A family might burn their bedding after a fever, stand barefoot on the frozen ground and watch their last blanket curl into flame, and still call it mercy, because to keep it would be worse. To risk another night with its memory, to sleep with what had once soaked in suffering. No. They let it go. The fire crackled. The eyes watered. And somewhere inside the warmth and the ruin, peace stirred. They said it was better to lose a thing than to lose a life. So they burned. And afterward, they held each other closer, wrapped in new cloth, or no cloth at all. Just breath and bone, and hope. Fire was not their enemy. It was their undoing, and their renewal. They feared it, yes, but they also trusted it, because when the time came, and nothing else could make the world feel clean again, they knew what had to be done. Some things never stopped. The itch, for instance. It was part of the body now, part of the day, part of the night, a background hum that rose and fell but never left. And so they endured. There was no ointment for it, no cream, no pill, no easy answer, only time. And tolerance. It might begin at the shoulder, a quiet suggestion under the wool, then the thigh, then the arch of a foot too long pressed against straw. It was the body's whisper, a plea or a protest. No one listened, not out of cruelty, but necessity. There was too much to do. And so the scratching became its own kind of rhythm, discreet, practiced, woven into the day like thread into linen. A woman stirring porridge with one hand, dragging her fingernails across her hip with the other. A man mending a gate, pausing only to reach under his tunic and claw at a place that had gone too long unnoticed. A child in church, legs swinging, fingers chasing an itch just behind the knee. It wasn't shameful. It was ordinary. As common as coughing, as invisible as breathing. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Sometimes the skin broke, fingernails too eager, flesh too thin, and blood came, a bright blue in the quiet cloth of the day. But even then, they kept moving, wrapped a rag around it, pressed it once, moved on. There was a kind of skill to it, knowing when to stop, when to scratch around the itch instead of through it, how to make it sting just enough to satisfy, without opening another wound. They learned young boys with scabbed elbows and dirt in their ears. Girls with red lines down their backs, tracing the shape of sleep. The straw beds didn't help, nor the wool shirts, nor the days without washing, the weeks without changing clothes, the constant layer of sweat that clung no matter the season. And yet it was lived with. They itched and endured, because complaining made no difference. And silence felt stronger. Only rarely did they speak of it. A mother noticing a rash along her child's ribs. A friend leaning close to whisper, "That looks raw." Otherwise, it was a private struggle. A small, constant test of patience. Some found ways to ease it. A wash in cold rain. A cloth soaked in vinegar. A leaf rubbed between fingers, crushed to release its balm. But nothing lasted, and so they turned inward, learned to carry it like a pebble in a shoe. Annoying, yes, but not. Enough to stop walking. Some said it was the body trying to let something out. That old sins, or old griefs, or old memories had to be scratched free. Others believed it was simply the cost of staying alive. Price the skin paid for sheltering the soul. There were worse pains. The ache of hunger. The chill of damp clothes. The hollow cold of loss. But the itch, it was always there. A quiet companion. Not cruel, just insistent. Even in sleep, it came. A movement beneath the blanket. A hand drifting from dream to habit. Scratching, even without waking And in that, there was something human, not something enduring. Because the body, for all its troubles, kept going. It bore the itch. It bore the day. It bore the burden. And never once asked to be thanked. Just to be. Allowed to endure. A man limping from a blister he would not mention. A girl hiding raw fingers beneath her apron. A grandmother sitting beside the hearth, running a comb across her scalp like a prayer dot. No one healed completely. But no one stopped trying. The itch was part of them. A reminder they still had skin. Still had nerves. Still had life. Because only the dead don't feel. And so, each morning, they rose. Still itching. Still enduring. Still reaching for another day that might, just might, sting a little less. The river was everything. It gave life. And it took things away. It wound its slow way past fields and footpaths, past thatched homes and leaning trees, always moving, even when the rest of the world stood still, and it ran brown, not blue, not clear, not the glassy perfection of paintings and poems. Brown, like the soil it carried, like the lives it passed. It wasn't dirty to them, not in the way we might say. It was just used. Touched by many things, marked by the world it served. They brought buckets to its banks, knelt with basins, dipped cloths, cupped hands. The water was cool, sometimes cold, sometimes alive with insects. But it was water, and water, no matter the color, was precious. Children waded in up to their knees, laughed when the mud sucked at their toes, sank fingers into silt, and watched it cloud up like smoke underwater. They didn't ask if it was clean. They asked if it was deep enough, if the current was slow, if the geese had left droppings where they planned to sit, because everyone knew the river was not just for washing. It was for everything. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. It held fish, sometimes, not often, not enough, but enough to hope. Cooled the livestock, soaked the flax, washed the clothes too stained for mere buckets. And it carried waste, not just from homes, but from outhouses, from barns, from bodies. What went into the chamber pot was flung into the stream, sometimes from doorsteps, sometimes carried further, as a courtesy, but always It found its way to water. Still, they used it, because where else would they go? The wells were shallow, the rain unpredictable, the air too dry or too frozen to offer anything useful. The river was there. Even if it wasn't perfect, they learned to use it carefully, to collect upstream when they could, to wash on the edge where the mud could settle. A woman rinsing her skirt would do so gently, not to make it clean, but to make it better, less stiff, less worn, less thick with the memory of labor. A man soaked his feet and watched the silt curl around his ankles like smoke. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask what else was in it. He just sighed and let the cold ease the ache. The river accepted everything. It did not discriminate. It did not judge. It carried filth and flowers in the same breath. A fish beside a rag, a broken bowl drifting beside a newborn's cry. It was a gathering place. Women knelt together, scrubbing, gossiping, humming under their breath. Children played nearby, throwing stones, catching frogs, dipping sticks. There was noise, laughter, shouting, splashing, all softened by the water's constant hush. And yet, sometimes it was quiet, still, the kind of still that let people think. Or forget. A boy sat by the edge, tossing pebbles, not to skip them, but just to watch the circles widen. A woman stood waist deep, holding her breath longer than needed, eyes closed. The river didn't take sides. It simply offered space, but not without cost. There were illnesses that came with it. Bellyaches, fevers, wounds that festered after a scrape in the wrong place. Some said the river knew, that it chose who to harm, that it punished wastefulness or pride. So they treated it with respect. Even as they dirtied it, they whispered to it, tossed herbs into it, left offerings, a crust of bread, a broken toy, a flower past its bloom. Still, it ran brown. They tried to clean in it, knowing they could never truly cleanse. But still, the motion mattered. The act, the intention. It was better than nothing. And better than nothing was often all they had. They taught their children where to wade, where to drink if desperate, where to stay away. They knew its moods, how it rose in spring, hungry and loud, how it shrank in summer, growing warm and thick, and when it froze, they missed its song, missed its gifts, missed the small hope of washing something, anything, away, because there was comfort in washing, even in brown water. Even if the dirt returned the next day. It was a pause, a soft interruption, a moment to say, this is mine, this is me, this is care. And care, like the river, didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to flow. Water was never just water. It looked harmless, clear, quiet, glistening in the sun. But beneath the surface, in barrels, in wells, in streams that seemed to sing, there was risk. It didn't wear a warning. It offered itself freely. But those who lived close to the land, they knew better. A sip from the wrong place could hollow the belly, twist it, take a child's laughter, and turn it into stillness. So they were careful. Not always able, but careful. Wells were prized and feared, covered with stones, ringed with prayer, sometimes blessed by priests who had seen too much. Mothers warned their children, don't lean too far. Don't take what hasn't been boiled. Don't trust still water. Still water was worst. It sat in buckets for too long. It grew quiet things, invisible, sharp-edged, waiting. A sip from a forgotten pail could bring a fever. A wash from a pond could open the skin to things that did not belong. And so, water was watched, respected, feared. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. When rain came, it was joy, but joy with conditions. Barrels caught it, cloths filtered it. Some would even speak over it, muttering blessings while it fell, hoping to keep it pure. But even rain could turn. It pooled in roofs, slipped through. Cracks brought rot to wood and damp to bones. Houses wept with it. Beds grew cold from it. Children wheezed when it stayed too long. And yet they needed it. They needed water to knead the bread, to soothe the burns, to steep the herbs. It was life, and it was danger. They boiled when they could, added ash to settle the worst of it, let it sit in the sun, hoping light might chase away what couldn't be seen. But hope wasn't always enough. Child would fall ill. A man would grip his belly and groan through the night. A woman's hands would shake, washing cloth in water she knew might not be safe, but had no choice. There were signs, they said. A shimmer that meant the water was cursed. A frog nearby, a good omen. A dead bird floating, a warning. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew about consequences. Still, they drank, carefully, quietly, often with a prayer whispered through cracked lips. Let it be good. Today, let it pass through me without pain. The strongest were not the ones with full bellies, but those who had learned which waters to trust. And when they passed this knowledge down, a grandmother might place a hand on a girl's wrist as she reached for a cup. Not that one. No explanation. Just wisdom shaped like instinct. The danger was not always in the drinking. Sometimes it came from the washing, from placing a wound in water that looked clean, from bathing a baby in a basin that had once held something else. Sometimes the water came to them. Floods rose without warning. Springs overflowed. Ground turned to sponge beneath careful feet. A home could be taken not by fire, but by water. Soft at first, then rising, then swallowing. But they rebuilt, mopped with skirts, dug trenches, prayed again, because they could not live without it. The water kept them alive, even as it kept them worried. And so, each time they touched it, they did so with care. Not reverence, not love, just awareness. A quiet nod to the truth. This can heal me, or this can end me. It ran under their homes, collected in the fields, seeped through stones and into their lives without asking. It wore no face, carried no name, but it was always present. And when someone lived to old age, they often said, I drank carefully, as if that alone had been the secret. Maybe it was. Maybe survival was just learning how to move through the world of water without inviting its anger. To boil when you could, to bless when you couldn't, to sip with care, to wash with caution, to fear it and still welcome it. Because water was not friend or foe. It was both. Not everything could be washed away. Some things had to be buried. Behind every cottage, behind every barn, behind every hedgerow, there was a place, quiet, ignored, necessary. The privy. A word that sounded polite, gentle, almost. But the reality was less forgiving. It was a hole, dug deep if time allowed, shallow if the ground was too hard, sometimes lined with wood, often not. A bench was laid over it, a plank with a hole, smoothed by years of use and nothing more. If one was lucky, there was a curtain, a door, if wealth or decency demanded. But more often, it was just space, open to the air, open to the sky, and open to everything the body had no choice but to give. They went alone, mostly, quietly, at dawn or dusk, or whenever the need arrived. Not much was said about it. Children were taught early. Don't go too close. Don't fall in. Don't ask questions. But questions lived there anyway. What did it mean that we left pieces of ourselves behind like this? That we dug holes, dropped them in, and walked away? It wasn't shame. It wasn't guilt. It was function. And function. Here was everything. Sometimes there was straw. sometimes ash, sometimes just the wind. There was no paper, no perfume, no flush, only the sound of breath, the creak of wood, and the soft pat of what passed for privacy. And if there was no privy, no time to build one, no space, no patience, there was the pit, dug near the trees, behind a stone wall, in the corner of a field where no one planted. There waste went, human, animal, all of it covered with dirt, marked with nothing. The earth accepted it, or tried to. Some thought the soil grew better after. Others wouldn't eat from such places. Either way, life continued, and the people learned to hold their noses, not because they were above it, but because they had no other choice. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The smell came and went with the wind. On hot days, it lingered like an uninvited guest. On cold nights, it froze, the stink turning crisp and strange. But always, it reminded them, the body doesn't stop. Even when the world is still, even when dignity begs for something better. And so, they adapted. A cloth pressed to the face, a handful of mint held under the nose, a quick breath, a quicker step. Some joked about it. Others refused to speak it. All. But everyone knew. It was part of being alive. The village shared stories of accidents. The neighbor who fell in and needed 3 men to pull him out. The boy who lit a candle and found out that gas and flame do not mix kindly. But most stories were quieter. Of fathers who rose in the night to empty the pot. Of mothers who carried the chamber bucket, careful not to spill a drop, barefoot in the frost. Because in the homes, there were pots. Clay or wood or metal, lined with leaves if you were lucky. In the dark of night, with no moon, no torch, no time, that was what you used. And came the morning. The task of emptying, carried out behind the house, tipped into the pit, rinsed if possible, forgotten until next time. It was not spoken of over bread, but it was understood. The body demanded, the body expelled, and the people responded with buckets, with holes, with silence. The priest said even this was holy. That waste reminded us we are not gods, that the smell of it was the smell of mortality. And perhaps they were right, because the pit did not lie. It held the truth of diet, of illness, of the passing of time. Some learned to read it. The old women, mostly. It would glance at what had been poured, sniff once, and say, something's wrong with him. A primitive doctoring. But often they were correct, and so even the pit, even the privy, became part of the village's wisdom. The unspeakable, quietly spoken. During plague, it changed. The holes grew deeper. The waste came more often. And the fear, it lingered. Longer than the stench. Some burned their buckets after each use. Some sprinkled herbs into the pit and hoped for mercy. Some just stood at the edge, watching steam rise, and whispered the only prayer they knew. Let this not be the end of me. But life returned. As it always did. The holes were filled. New ones dug. The body, unstoppable, continued its rhythm. And the people adapted again, because they always had. And in the end, when a home was abandoned or a field turned to wild, the only thing that remained, the only clue that someone had once lived there, was often the pit. A hollow in the earth, soft around the edges, sunken, rich with the proof of ordinary lives. And maybe that's not as unpleasant as it sounds. Maybe it's beautiful, in a strange, earthy way, because even in their leaving, they returned something to the soil. Even in waste, there was worth. Some things were always moving. Even when the body sat still, even when the eyes closed, even when the world around them paused, the hands kept working. Not out of ambition, not for glory, just to keep life going. Hands shaped everything. They kneaded the bread, split the wood, tended the fire, sewed the patches, combed the hair, turned soil into food, cloth into shelter, warmth into memory got, and they bore the proof. Calluses where the axe had rubbed, blisters from iron pots and frozen buckets, cuts that never closed quite right, stains that no wash could lift. A woman's hands were strong, not soft, but not hard either. They cradled babies and cleaned soot from stone. They braided hair and caught chickens. They stirred porridge and cupped cold water onto sleeping foreheads. A man's hands were weathered like old bark, split at the nails, blackened beneath, knuckles thick from years of holding things that did not want to be held. They dug graves and built fences, hammered roofs and brushed crumbs from cheeks. Even the smallest hands were not spared. Children learned young to carry, to gather, to grip, to help. There was always something to be done. And so the hands never rested. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. At night, by candlelight or fire's edge, the hands still moved, knitting, fixing, shelling peas, spinning wool. The mind tired, the back ached, but the hands, they kept going, as if afraid to stop, because stopping meant stillness, and stillness meant hunger. Idle hands were not dangerous. They were unthinkable. Even in prayer, they folded. Even in grief, they reached. To clasp a hand was a kind of language. A father placing his palm on a son's shoulder. A woman pressing her thumb into the base of her wrist, where she always ached but never said so. A child holding their mother's hand, just because it felt like home. In winter, hands cracked, split in tiny lines that bled when water touched them. They rubbed them with lard, wrapped them in cloth, whispered curses or prayers, depending on the day. In summer, they blistered, from rope, from sun, from stone walls warm too hot to climb. But still, they didn't stop. They tied knots in silence, wove baskets that creaked under weight, carved spoons with blunt knives and soft patience. The village's story was written in their hands, not in ink, but in effort. And no two were the same. Some hands trembled from age. Others twitched from tasks they couldn't finish. Some were missing fingers. Some were missing feeling. But all kept moving. They worked through joy, through sorrow, through birth, through death. When someone passed, it was the hands that prepared them, that washed the limbs, tied the chin, folded the shroud. And even then, even in stillness, the hands held meaning. People looked at them, touched them one last time, said things they never said while the hands were still warm. Thank you. You did enough. Some said you could read a life from the hand, that the lines meant more than fate. They meant labor, sacrifice, endurance, a curved scar down the palm, a burn from the forge, a raised line along the thumb, from shears that slipped, a patch of skin gone smooth, worn from a lifetime of kneading. No medals, no records, just proof. And even when the hands rested at last, tucked beneath blankets or crossed in final peace, the world they helped make went on. The bread they baked was eaten. The walls they mended still stood. The wool they spun warmed someone sleeping. And so, in a way, the hands never really stopped. They just passed the work forward. To other hands, younger, newer, already learning how to ache. It was not tragic. It was how things survived. In a world without machines, without ease, without pause. The hands carried everything. And they did not complain. They wiped tears, wiped tables, wiped the day from tired faces. They braided the hair of girls who would grow into women, who would do the same. They held the tools that planted seeds and buried kin. And at the end of each day, when the hands were finally allowed to go still, just for a few hours, they curled into themselves. Palms turned inward, fingers bent like petals folding it. Dusk. Tired, but never useless. In a world where dirt was constant, cleanliness could feel unnatural. It stood out. Like a quiet room in a noisy village. Like a dry cloak in a storm. People noticed. And sometimes they didn't like it. To be too clean, too free of stain, too polished, too careful, was to be different. And different here was dangerous. Man who washed too often was thought vain, or soft, or suspiciously lucky. A woman who smelled of herbs instead of hearth was whispered about. Where does she get the time? Who is she trying to impress? Because most people had dirt beneath their nails. Most people smelled of smoke and wool, and meat gone sour. So when someone didn't, it made others wonder, what are they hiding? What are they trying to wash away? They called it pride, called it arrogance, or worse, called it unnatural, because no one had time to be clean without help. And help too often meant wealth, and wealth meant secrets. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Sometimes it meant danger. In times of sickness, when plague moved through the streets like wind through wheat, the clean were eyed carefully. Why hadn't they fallen ill? Why did their skin still glow? Why did their clothes still smell of soaproot and mint when everyone else reeked of survival? Whispers began. She bathes too much. He boils his clothes. They use potions, charms, dark things. And just like that, cleanliness became evidence of vanity, of deception, of witchcraft. Women were especially vulnerable. If their hair was too tidy, if their hands were too soft, if their home smelled too sweet, they were watched. The line between careful and cursed was thin. No one spoke it aloud, but they looked, and they remembered. A basin left drying in the sun, a brush of rosemary across the threshold, a girl with skin too smooth for someone who worked in the fields. Some were lucky. Their cleanliness was tolerated, admired even in hushed tones, but others were not, and in the wrong season, in the wrong sickness, in the wrong light, soap became suspicion. They asked questions that weren't questions. Your hands don't look like they've been digging. You smell like a priest's robe. How does your child stay so well fed? And behind those words was a knife. Because if you weren't suffering like the rest of them, maybe you weren't one of them. In a world of shared hardship, sameness was safety. If you itched, wept, shivered like your neighbor, you belonged. But if you did not, you stood alone. The irony was quiet, but deep. They feared disease, but feared its absence more. They longed for health, but distrusted those who had it. And so many learned to hide it. To rinse the skin, but leave a little soot. To burn herbs only when the wind was blowing east. To scrub the clothes and then hang them behind the house, where fewer eyes wandered. Even healing became secret. A salve tucked in a pocket, a poultice brewed at night, a prayer muttered while pretending not to care, because the world had taught them too much care was cause for suspicion. It wasn't always cruel, just frightened. People didn't want to hate the clean. They just didn't understand them. And fear, more than anything, clings to what it cannot explain. So they kept there. Cleanliness quiet, hidden in the folds of aprons, rinsed behind trees, sewn into the hems of skirts. Some refused to change. They stayed clean, despite the whispers, despite the sideways glances, despite the risk, because they believed in it, in the power of ritual, of water, of intention. They'd rather be feared than filthy, but most adapted, dulled their shine. softened their scent. Let the dirt cling a little longer, just enough to blend in, just enough to belong. And maybe that was the hardest part, not the scrubbing, not the secrecy, but the knowledge that something gentle, something good, had to be hidden, that even care could become a threat. Still, they persisted, because even if no one thanked them, the skin did, the spirit did, the children who were held by clean hands. They knew, even if they never had the words, there's something strangely tender about the scent of someone you live beside. Not perfume, not soap, just the way wool holds warmth, the way bodies hold smoke, the way beds remember skin. In the medieval village, everyone carried a smell, but no one carried it alone. It was a shared scent of ash and sweat, of straw and fire, of damp feet and dried herbs, of milk turned sour and linen never quite dry. And somehow it was comforting, because no one was spared. No one rose from their bed perfectly clean. No one came home from the fields untouched. Even the priest smelled of wax and wool. Even the baker of yeast and coal. You knew your family by scent, not because they stank, but because they were. A mother's shoulder carried the trace of flour. A father's sleeve held hay and leather. A child's neck, the sun and the dirt, and whatever they'd been playing in that day. And that, in its own strange way, was safety. It meant they were close. It meant they were real. It meant they were yours. No one judged. There was no expectation of lavender, no pressure to mask, only the quiet understanding that life was strong, and so were its smells. And when everyone shared the same ones, it didn't matter. It didn't divide. It connected. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. At night, under blankets that had never seen soap, families curled together, skin against skin, breath against breath. The air warm with presence. The scent was thick, but it was theirs. It meant no one was alone. And when someone left for war, or plague, or death, it wasn't just the voice they missed, or the face. It was the smell, the pillow without. It felt wrong. The shirt left behind felt empty. The house, suddenly sharper, suddenly unfamiliar. Grief had a scent, too. Cold wood, unburned fat, air that didn't carry anyone. Some tried to keep the scent. They'd press their face into a tunic, bury a bonnet in the bottom of a chest, light the same herbs, just to remember. Because in a world with so few photographs, memory lived in the nose. Shared smell also meant shared labor. You knew who had baked that morning, their hands sweet with flour, who had slaughtered, their boots heavy with it, who had gathered herbs, green under their nails. The smells lingered long after. The work was done. And that, too, was a kind of honor. Children learned the sense of safety. The warm, sour smell of rising bread, the sweet smoke of peat, the faint iron of blood after birth. They also knew warning smells, the stink of illness, the sharp rot of infection, the acrid edge of something burning too fast. And so, scent became language. You didn't have to ask. You could smell it. A visitor carried the scent of another village, slightly different wool, different wood, different soil. It made people wary, curious, careful, but also fascinated, because even in sameness, there were notes of difference. A richer cheese, a smokier fire, a field that grew garlic. But within a home, sameness brought comfort. Siblings carried the same undertones. Spouses learned each other's scent like a map. And when someone returned from days away, the air around them was the first thing noticed. Not their face, their presence. And when someone was gone too long, weeks, months, forever, that smell became legend. He always smelled of beeswax and barley. Her hair held rosemary for days. Not compliments, just truths, gentle ones. And in those shared truths, there was intimacy. In a world where water was precious, where soap was scarce,